to mental health remains there. And there is a sense that the great American is kind of Daniel Boone and is out exploring and is facing every danger and is coming through everything, smelling like a rose. I don't know if Daniel Boone smelled like a rose, but in any event, you have the general idea. And I think we want people to be strong. And I think that people who are having a difficult time are threatened by the evidence of other people's weakness, that it often attaches to a weakness within those people. But I also think that there is a kind of misapprehension that getting treatment for depression or anxiety or any of these other problems is somehow a bridge that you cross and then you can never come back, that you've gone over the Rubicon and there will be no return. And people think that you become this different kind of person. You become a person who is reliant on therapy. You become a person who is reliant on medication, and you'll never get your integrity back. And I always say to people when they're in that mode of saying, I'm going to tough it out, I say, look, try taking medication or try doing therapy or try whatever it is that you might want to try. And if it helps, great. And if it doesn't help, you can always go back. And if it helps, but you somehow decide you don't like the way it makes you feel, give it a few months and see what your overall sense of yourself is like, and then you can change your mind. It's not this permanent, unsolvable, never again will you be your true self. People somehow think that medication actually changes your personality. And there was a wonderful cartoon some years ago in the New Yorker in which there's a woman in a psychiatrist's office saying, "Doctor, the medication isn't working. I still have feelings." And I think we should have feelings, and we do have feelings, and we have a lot of feelings when we're on medication. And it's not like the medication makes you lose all of the feelings you have. But I've sometimes said to people, when I was really depressed, I felt incredibly sad about having to take a shower, and I felt incredibly overwhelmed by using the telephone, and I felt incredibly stressed by having to deal with a friend who'd stopped by. And now I feel incredibly sad about environmental catastrophe, and I feel incredibly frustrated by the persistence of racism in the United States of America, and I feel traumatized by climate change. And I feel like those are things it is a better locus for one's anxiety and despair and hard feelings and grief. And having your grief available to address the problems of the world or to address the loss of somebody you love or the people who died or even the loss of your job, being available to deal with those things instead of being utterly overwhelmed by pulling yourself out of bed and changing out of your pajamas. That's actually the nature of vitality, and vitality is what we're after.
Oh my God. Just want that to sit there and let people be able to process that, because you said so much that's so important. I have wondered if the recent polls by the Kaiser Family Foundation that show 50% of Americans now saying they're suffering from some mental health disorder to be a positive thing in some way, that perhaps people are waking up to the essential nature of our interior and how we should be minding it. Do you think there's anything positive about this, Andrea?
Well, I mean, it's obviously not positive that so many people are having such a hard time.
Yeah.
My heart goes out to the people who are struggling and suffering, and if we could make their depression remit, it would be fantastic.
Yeah.
But if people are willing to acknowledge their depression or their anxiety or any other form of mental illness or distress that they're experiencing, that really represents significant progress. And I think that it's difficult for the stigma to remain so acute about a condition that's affecting half the people in the country. Yeah. There's a point at which, if you're looking at your TV, if you're watching online, if you're paying attention, you know that this is happening to almost everyone. I mean, half of the country, at least, which feels like almost everyone. And there's a point at which you have to say, okay, so what is everyone doing about it? And it makes it easier to address getting some form of treatment or some form of attention for yourself. So that's the upside, but I hope that the mental illness won't persist indefinitely. I hope people will begin to feel better as they return to normal life. Some people will, and for some people, the sort of instability that this has introduced into their understanding of the world is going to be there for a long time.
I've often wondered, because you've been so brilliant on the topic of resilience, developing resilience, how you did it in your own, pulling yourself out of your deep, deep depression, whether there were some things that you learned during that you haven't already spoken about, that you haven't really shared. Is there something that would be applicable to people's lives today that might help them?
Well, I would say that the first thing is to understand that depression does exist very widely. I think it's important to understand that it exists on a spectrum.
Mm.
I think it's important to understand that the opposite of depression is not happiness but vitality, and that a lot of what you experience in depression is not feeling sad, though you may feel sad as well, but feeling overwhelmed and unable to deal with the basic business of your ordinary life. And so if people can be awake to that, then they can say, oh, the fact that I have all this time, but I can't manage to give my kid a bath, that's actually a loss of vitality. And
Mm-hmm.
even if I'm not sitting in my room crying, it's a sign of depression that I should address. If people are able to say, oh, the fact that I feel this level of concern about what's going to happen to my job on the far side of what happened has now escalated beyond reasonable concern and into the realm of clinical anxiety. I just wish people could be awake to those transitions and understand that most of us are now experiencing, most of us actually, not just the 50% who describe themselves as having mental health issues, but most of us are experiencing more sadness and more sense of being uncertain about the future, because we're in a sad situation and our future is in fact very uncertain. So there is a kind of rational response. But when that rational response affects your ability to do what you need to do to address the concerns that that response pertains to, then you've developed an illness or a situation that requires some address. But if you just feel generally sad about the state of the world, that's fine. If you feel like you're so sad about the state of the world that it's impeding your ability to improve the state of the world insofar as you can in your own particular and perhaps miniature way, then that's the point at which you really have depression.
I want to talk about, because it's Gay Pride Month, and this is a wonderful, generally time for celebration and parties and parades, and obviously that's not going to happen. So how can people still be supportive of one another, still celebrate the gains that have been made, and also to provide some hope for activists that are out there still working?
Well, I mean, it is Gay Pride, and it's been kind of heartbreaking getting all of the messages that I get from all the gay organizations that I'm involved with saying, you know, instead of having a parade, we're going to have a Zoom call on Wednesday for 20 minutes. And it just feels to me like that's not much of a fiesta.
Right.
I think that it's a difficult time for gay people. More gay people are single. People who are in the LGBTQ community are more likely to be impoverished. There's a lot in the media about middle-class white men like me who've managed to get married and live pleasantly and comfortably, but an awful lot of the community, particularly are LGBTQ people of color who are living in situations in which there's very little tolerance for them.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are turning in this moment for comfort to religious institutions, and the prejudice against gay people in religious institutions remains very ingrained, and that gay people who are experiencing that kind of prejudice may feel cut off from the reassurances that might come in the belief that there is a God who has a purpose in all of what's going on. There are many ways in which I think it's difficult for gay people. But I have been impressed in this month also at how much evidence I've seen of gay people reaching out to one another, of people who are LGBTQ, who are in one way or another trying to come together in groups and to bring about support. And while it is depressing to have Pride Month during the quarantine, it is, on the other hand, encouraging that during this quarantine, at least we have Pride Month, and it gives us an occasion to reach out to one another and to celebrate our ways of life and not to feel as lonely and cut off as many people, especially outside of major urban centers, often do.
Andrew, I could talk to you forever, but I promise to keep this at half an hour. And I promise I will circle back with you from time to time because honestly, I think in terms of a voice that really, really speaks to people from deep, deep lived experience, but also just your exhausting research that you do on these topics, it makes you almost the perfect person as a spokesperson for those of us who would like to see more attention paid to mental health. Thank you again so much for being with us, and continued safe quarantine for you and your family.
Thank you, Sheila. This has been a lovely conversation.